we might, and will we turn off maybe those lights as well, Julia? Those, yeah.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me? Ladies and gentlemen? Yeah. Good morning. Yeah. Okay, folks, we're going to start. Can we have a bit of quiet, please? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, yeah, if you could take your seats, please. I'd like to welcome you all this morning to our penultimate lecture, if you can believe it. Just one left after today, so I hope everybody has been enjoying the series so far. I'm delighted to welcome Regina Sexton, who is an old friend of ours here in Tipperery Museum and of this lecture series. Many of you will have heard Regina speak in our original series 10 years ago on the Big House, and some of you may be familiar with the lovely recordings she did for us on Barnbrack and all the traditions associated with that, and not so long ago our Pancake Tuesday recipe as well, which are all available on our website if anybody's interested. So I don't think Regina needs any introduction from me. Her reputation and her experience goes before her, so I'm delighted to hand over to Regina.
Great. Thank you very much, Julia, and again thank you for the invitation to visit Clonmel. I'm always really happy to leave the county of Cork and go to other places, with the understanding that I'll return to my bed in Cork this evening. So it's great to be here, and thank you again, and thanks as well to my help here with the mic and the technology and so on. I know that you have had a series of lectures on the Big House, so I've come along today to talk to you about the food and culinary cultures of the big houses in Ireland. And I know that Julia said that I was here around 10 years ago now, which is frightening. And I spoke about sort of food in the country house at that point as well. But since then, I've done a lot of research looking specifically at the. I'll go through it all with you later on. The cookery books associated with many of the big estates in Ireland. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is based on that research that I would have been engaged in from around 2015 until around 2020. And I'll explain all that to you. So first of all, before I go any further, can all of you hear me? That's fine. Yeah, all right. It's great to see you all in a circle as well. It's really great because I can see everybody. Julia tells me that this is the council chambers, so we're very important this morning. So what I'm going to do is, as I said, I'm going to look at food in the country house in Ireland. And I'm also going to kind of introduce you to the sources of information. How do we know about food in the country house? And so on. So what you see here, and if we could as well maybe take those lights down, that would be great, because I know it might be kind of hard to see the PowerPoint if you're further down. So what you see in here in this opening slide is just a photograph of one of the pages from the handwritten recipe books that are associated with the big houses. And they're a really important source of information, but they're only one source of information, I suppose, really. So what we're looking at for the talk today is what are the different sources of information that we can draw on to put together, to piece together the story of the food in the big houses and the big estates. And one of the big sources is like the one that I've just showed you, the photograph there, are what we call manuscript recipe books or manuscript receipt books. Receipt being the word for, obviously, something that you receive, because that was part of the culture as well, particularly amongst elite women, or even housekeepers, or the cook, to exchange recipes between themselves. There are also printed cookery books, and I actually brought one along there, and I'll take that out later on when we get on to her. So there are printed cookery books that we can look at as a source of information. But there's also things like diaries and letters that are diaries that are being kept by women or by men, as we'll see later on today, and the letters in particular. And the letters are an extremely interesting sort of primary research for historians, because letters were Well, I think we're from a generation where we actually know what a letter is, and that we might have had some engagement with letters ourselves, printed, handwritten letters, and sending them through the post. But when you think about letters in the time that we're looking at, and it will be a lot in the 18th century, the exchange of letters is really fascinating in terms of the volume and the frequency of exchange. They were like the texts of their days, because the post would be delivered in several different times as well during the day. There's also things like contemporary literature, if you look at literature that's contemporary to the time that you're looking at, or the era. And of course there's the whole world of material culture, the material of the kitchen, the utensils, the kitchen itself, and the utensils that are associated with it. And I'll show you some illustrations of those too. And the other thing, I suppose, a kind of an area to look at is this whole area of experimenting, trying to cook the dishes from the cookery books of this time and so on, right? And there are people who actually make a living from that in England specifically, not so much in Ireland. But I've done a lot of this reconstructions as well. Just to show you some of the printed cookery books, the printed sources, these are secondary sources. So these are two big ones that are coming out of England. One is by a historian called Sarah Pennell, and the other is by a historian called Gilly Lehman. And these are two historians that have looked at either the evolution of the kitchen, as in the case of Sarah Pennell, or in the case of Gilly Lehman, looking at the British housewife. This is taking a very close and forensic look at manuscript receipt books and published cookery books as well. Okay, they would be two big ones. In an Irish context, I would have published some work in this area as well, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But there is also another historian from Ireland called Madeleine Shanahan, who's now based in Australia. She's Australian, but she was here for her research, and she's married to an Irishman and all sorts of stuff. So she was based in Dublin, and she she published this book as it's a monograph of her PhD thesis. It's manuscript receipt books as archaeological objects. Okay, she also most recently, I just put it in there as a matter of interest, she published most recently a book on Christmas food and feasting. Okay, so there is a whole sort of community, I suppose, of historians that look at the idea of the recipe. Okay, the recipe as a cultural fact, I suppose, if you like. And again, now, just to make the point here, and I need to make it, is that if you mention sort of recipes as being an academic concern or a source that people look at academically, you could notice that that sort of is dismissed as being not a very serious kind of pursuit and so on. It kind of is a pursuit maybe that's associated with women, and this kind of association between that area and women can be looked upon as being something frivolous, to pass the time, a women's thing, right? But actually, that's not why historians look at them at all. I mean, they look at them for the content of the recipe, how the cooking styles, the ingredients. But that's only one level of investigation, because the recipes are a manifestation of what's going on in society. Okay, they tell you about what's going on in society, they tell you about fashion, they tell you about economics, they tell you about trade, they tell you about nationalism, they tell you about colonialism, and all sorts of stuff, okay? So you could, in a very superficial way, say, this isn't really research, this isn't really history. But when you dig down deeper into them, and when you look at them from a depth, they are extremely important historical documents. I mentioned to you that, to take the recipe off the page and to put it into practice to see if these recipes actually work is something that a lot of people do in England. Most recently, the person emerging is, you'll find him on Twitter and Instagram and all sorts of stuff, somebody called the Regency Cook. He is based in England, and he's working in a Regency house, and he moved in there and all sorts of stuff, and he has a kitchen, Regency kitchen, and he's recreating recipes associated with the time of the house, okay? But I suppose the most well-known person to look at recipes in England, I'm kind of curtailed in my wandering here by this podium, so I'm just going to go back and wander around. The most well-known and I suppose the most respected food historian that recreates these dishes is somebody called Ivan Day. Okay, he's based in England as well. So he's a food historian and he recreates all these recipes. And I suppose the thing to say about Ivan Day and his recreations is that possibly largely through the media and film and all sorts of stuff, there is this perception that food in the past was crude and unsophisticated, and just composed of just big bits of meat and big legs of animals and all sorts of stuff. And that couldn't be further from the truth, because the sophistication and the skill and the technique that was required to produce these dishes, to cook them in the kitchens, and the material culture, what you needed to create these kitchens in terms of utensil and so on, was extremely sophisticated and extremely elaborate. And if you look at Ivan Day and what he does, you can see how skilled the cooks had to be, the chefs had to be, the confectioners had to be, the ice cream makers, and so on. It's mind-boggling, really. And he has a site, you can go onto the site and see these spectacular recreations. I suppose I should say that the time that I'm thinking about mostly in my head for this presentation is through the 18th century and into parts of the 19th century as well, particularly for Ireland. Because for in Ireland, the high point of the aristocracy and the Anglo-Irish, the high point of that culture in terms of their influence, their wealth, and their buildings of their estates and their houses and the lands associated with them, the high point of that was through the 18th century, and particularly in the second half of the 18th century, when Ireland experiences an economic boom on the back, in many cases, of producing and exporting food, particularly across the Atlantic. So that's the time I'm looking at, really, and into a part of the 19th century. And that's the recipe books that I've looked at for the most part. I'll go through those with you in a minute. But just go back to Ivan Day there. You can see him. I'll see there now if I can. Oh gosh, what am I after doing? Oh yeah. I don't know if I have a dot here. Do I have a dot? Oh, here it is. So there's Ivan Day there, look, and he's down there as well. And what he's actually doing in this composite shot is he's recreating ice creams and ices from written sources, cookery books. And he has these, he not just has the recipe, but he also has the equipment here for churning the ice or the ice cream. And here he's got a whole collection of illustrations that indicate the range of different molds that were available to create all the different shapes. And you can see some of them here being created in the recipe books itself. And then his recreations here. You can see this is a historical mold and all sorts of stuff. Actually, this slide doesn't do justice to the finesse and the beauty of the work, really. If you go onto his site, just Google Ivan Day, and you'll see what he does. It's absolutely spectacular. And a very skilled and craft activity. Now, I've created a lot of the dishes, and I'll go on and I'll show you some of my recreations in a minute that are not up to speed or up, on the same level as Ivan Day. But I suppose my work, this is England, but my work would be based on Irish collections of recipes. But saying all that, you can't say that there is a big difference between England or Britain and Ireland at this point in time, because we must remember Ireland is a colony of the British Empire. So Ireland is just the island of the other island, so to speak. And in that regard, the gentry and the aristocracy, from which these manuscript recipe books are emanating for the most part, they have intimate connections with England, be it politically or be it through family connections and so on. So, you know, the relationship between Ireland and England is a very close one. So obviously, the food culture and the culinary culture is almost identical, okay? There's no difference. And that's what they're aspiring to. They're aspiring to the fashions of the empire, and they're recreating and wanting to have the trends that are going around society in terms of food and cooking and dishes and all sorts of stuff. So there's no difference at all, because they see themselves as English, as part of the empire. I said to you that most of what I'm going to say today is in the 18th century, but there's always a but. One of the areas I did look at, though, was looking at some earlier recipe books associated with Ireland. And I say associated because that's an important caveat of a term. So one of the collections of recipes that I had been fascinated by for a long time was a collection associated with, anyone care to guess? It's not a great shot, but this here? Excellent, yeah, Burr Castle. So, some William Parsons would have been one of the ancestors connected with the family in Burr, the Parsons of Burr. He would have been one of the adventurers came to Ireland as part of the colonisation process at the end of the 16th century and was granted a lot of lands, as was his brother Lawrence, okay? And it's Lawrence who will go on to settle in Burr and build the castle. Not the castle you're seeing now, because that's a later makeover, I suppose, of the site. But anyway, getting back to Burr, I was always fascinated by Burr because I had heard since I was a young historian, because now I'm getting to be an old historian, I had heard that Burr had a collection of recipes, an early collection of recipes in the castle, okay? So I can't go into, this is a great story, but I can't go into it in great detail because I've got too many slides. Anyway, Burr Castle, the family, the ancestors of the Parsons, the original kind of, I suppose, adventurers and adventurous men who came over as part of the colonisation process, the ancestors of William and Lawrence in particular, are still resident in the house up to the present day, and their family continue to live there as well. So you have Lord and Lady Parsons here, Alicia Ross and Brendan Ross, okay? And they're very interesting because they have what they call in the castle a muniments room where they keep all the documents, particularly the documents relating to land leases and so on. And of course that's the key to their influence and their embeddedness in Ireland is the control over land and leasing lands and all sorts of land ownership essentially. But anyway, they have a muniments room, which is where Lord Ross is sitting there. You can see all the boxes behind him. So they have their own, a monuments room is a little small archive, okay? Or it can be a big archive as well. But in the case of Burr, it's a small archive. And in the archive, which they have been upkeeping and cataloguing in association with Offaly County Council, in their collections is the recipe book that I was always fascinated by. Just there you go is kind of some of the background. Burr Castle was formerly Parsons Town House in County Offaly. It's the Parsons of Burr. Okay, and Burr Castle specifically is associated with Lawrence of Burr in Youghal. He was also granted, Lawrence was granted lands in Youghal. And his brother was William Parsons, who comes over, look, at the end of the 19th century, and they're working on the crown they're working with the crown to look at the lands that have been confiscated and see how they'll be divided up and all sorts of stuff. They're adventurers, you know. And as part of their work in Ireland, they get granted land all over the place, right? William goes on to become a baronet. And he resides in Dublin, and he goes on to become a baronet, which is really significant because what you now have is you have members, I suppose, high-ranking officials and wealthy men now kind of entering into the ranks of the aristocracy and so on. So that's what they're aiming for. And so the brother got it before Lawrence, the younger brother in Burr. Okay. Anyway, so so after the plantations of Louth, Lawrence establishes himself in Burr, right? And this the Parsons of Parsonstown. But just going back to the photograph of Brendan there sitting in the room with all the boxes behind him, I had been aware that they had a recipe book, right? A very early recipe book. And when I say early, it's early because Irish recipe books don't come on, the handwritten ones, don't come online until the end of the 17th century, okay? When things are kind of calming down in terms of the colonisation process for Ireland. Anyway, so I spent some time in the Moonamans room, and again, now this is a great photograph, my apologies, and this is the book here, right? And this is a collection of recipes from 1666, right? And this is one of the, this is the second recipe in the book actually. It's a recipe to make jumbles. Jumbles are biscuits. And the book is assigned to somebody called Dorothy Parsons, and it's her book of choice recipes, 1666. Anyway, I can't get into that, but between the jigs and the reels, this is another recipe from that collection. You can see the hand is very eligible, and it's very clear. This is a recipe to make artichoke pie, right? Anyway, I was fascinated by this collection of recipes because it was 1666, a very early date. And the recipes in there are they're really bang on trend and bang on fashion. But they include all really exotic ingredients: herbs, spices, fruits from the Mediterranean, things like ambergris, which is a flavourant, which has come as a kind of a spew from Wales, from the big whales of the sea, that they use to perfume and give this sort of both perfume and taste to food and all sorts of stuff. Anyway, so I was fascinated by this happening in Birr in the middle of Ireland in 1666, so I was really interested in the collection. The back of the book, which we can't see, and that book has actually been recovered in more recent times. It's been rebound and with a new cover on it, the one that you saw. At the back of that, and they kind of meet in the middle, is a collection of medicinal recipes for ailments and cures and all sorts of stuff. Anyway, I can't go into this because we've only 1 hour and 1 day, because this could go on for days. Between the jigs and the reels, what I discovered was the book wasn't written in Birr. The book was written outside London by Dorothy Parsons, who was one of the ancestors of Lawrence Parson. The Parsons are thrown out of the castle. Well, not actually thrown out. They're escorted out of the castle during the Puritan era, the Cromwellian era. They're escorted out of the castle very peacefully, actually, and they all go and live in England for a while. They're thrown out, essentially, and then they come back. But one of the daughters, Dorothy, doesn't come back, I don't think. She stays in London. She gets married, and she gets married to somebody called Parsons, right? So there's Dorothy Parsons married to another Parsons. He's associated with a big house outside London, near Windsor actually, called Langley, in Slough. And anyway, I went over there and all sorts of stuff, and I don't think the book was written in Birr. It was written by Dorothy, because there was a whole investigation going on with who was signing off the recipes and all sorts of stuff. So I don't think it was written in Birr. She dies, and I think she's buried back in Ireland because we had to look at her birth records and her marriage records and all sorts of stuff. So it's not Dorothy. She's one of the family, but it's not written in Birr, but it has an association with Birr, which is going back to my point really, that this is a sort of is one kind of case study of how ideas spread, how recipes are transmitted, how fashions and culture and all sorts of stuff blend in together within this particular elite community. But anyway, let's get on to something that is written in Ireland, and this is associated with this house. Anyone know this one? It's not in Offaly. This is Townley Hall in just not far from Drogheda in County Louth, right? And this is another estate, okay, of the family, the Townley Balfours, okay? So that's the house. Again, now this is a late 18th century improvement to the house. There was a house on the land already, but this is a late 18th century improvement, and you can see the classical styles. Very minimalist in its design and so on by one of the Townley Balfours. You can see here, for example, when you enter into the house, there is this spectacular cantilevered staircase. It's absolutely beautiful. And at the top of it is this glass opening to the sky. You can see it here. So the Townley Balfour is associated with the Townley Balfour family. The house is still there. It is kind of open to the public. They're kind of not doing an awful lot with it. I'm not really too sure 100% of where the ownership is at the moment. But if we just look at it in terms of the area in and around the time of the 18th century, this is into the 19th century, as you can see. But you can see here that the Balfours, here look, they're the hash. Now, the colours aren't coming across really well. But look, this is County Louth anyway, but these are, look, they're not far from Drogheda up here. These are the Balfours, so they have, that's where Townley Hall is. Not far from the Boyne, actually. But they also have lands in other parts as well. Look, you can see these green areas here are Balfour lands. And they would originally have imparted the settlement as well into Ireland. They'd have come down from Northern Ireland. And they settled in County Louth in the 18th century. Now, the other thing as well that you can see here, though, is that they're kind of minor gentry in this whole kind of collection of estates in the smallest county of Ireland now, okay, County Louth. You can see the diversity and the variety of landholdings, landowners and their big estates, right? So look, they're kind of really minor gentry. Here, look, there you go, bit there, bit there, bit there. And the big people are the Foster Massarenes here in the kind of the burgundy colour, and the Anglicys up here, all right? Anyway, the reason I was interested in Townley Hall was the fact that the family kept a series of recipe books going through time. But they're not the only family who would have kept recipe books through time. It's the fact that these are recipe books that survive, that are extant. I should explain to you as well how I kind of how I find all of these things. The National Library in Dublin, the one on just down from Kildare Street, has probably the biggest collection of manuscript receipt books in the country. Okay, and how they have the receipt books is that they would have been bequeathed to the museum, or the library actually. They would have been bequeathed to the museum as part of the more extensive estate papers that come in from various different big estates. So just to kind of keep in mind that the estate is like the big estates, and I know you would have heard this from people like Terence Dooley and all sorts of stuff if you were here for those lectures. Like the estates in Ireland were extremely well managed, depending on whether you had landlord living or absentee, but they were still extremely well managed, ordered, managed, and a lot of their activities were in rent, obviously, and farming, but also in managing the estate lands, particularly if they were living in Ireland, to produce food for the table and to buy food in as well. So you have a whole community, you know, within any estate. So if you have a community of people and workers and all sorts of stuff with various different activities going on of consequence, you need to have good records. So that's why the estates have, not all of them, and a lot of them would have been destroyed as well during the burning of the forecourts and all that. But if you do have estate records in the big houses, they can be various in the sort of the items that they contain. A lot of these estate papers were given to the state, and a lot of those collections are in the National Library in Dublin. Okay, you'll find others in the National Archives, things like that as well. You have some private collections of recipe books, like the case of the 1666 collection from Burr. But anyway, the National Museum. So, like, if we go back there to think about the Townleys in the context of things like the Massarenes and the Ansleys, if you don't have estate papers there for those, you're not going to get maybe the recipe books and so on. It just so happens that Townley kept very good records, and their extant recipe books are really interesting because they go through time. So that's why I selected to look at those, because that was the source material available. So look, this is one of the Townley Balfours here, who did the makeover of the house, that beautiful house that we've just seen. But this is what they have in terms of their collections. They have, so this is the National Museum of Ireland manuscript 9563, and this is one of the earliest, and it's associated with a woman, not really sure who she is, but it's associated with Mrs. Jane Bury. She probably has connection with the family. And then you have other ones down here, so this is 1770. It's not too far away from 1666. It's not the earliest, because there's others in between as well that are actually written in Ireland. But look, there are other ones then that go through the late 18th century. One associated with Lady Florence Balfour. And then you have loose pages, and then you have miscellaneous documents as well. One of them is There are 2 small collections in the Trinity archives as well. So that's what I looked at in detail. But I looked at it in the context of the wider context of the recipe books that are in the National Library of Ireland. Okay, and what I did, it was for a publication. So what I would do here in the case of the recipe books is that I would look at them and I would look at the types of recipes they have, and I go on and I'll explain that to you later on. And I'll come back and I'll show you some of the breakdown charts as well that Madeleine Shanahan has done in terms of consumption of different ingredients, particularly sugar, which is really interesting. So that was one sort of focus case study of looking at along with Dorothy Parsons, which I can't go into the nuts and bolts of that study with you because we don't have time, but her book is really interesting as well. But that's only one book. But Burghcastle does have a series of cookery books that go into the early 20th century as well. I didn't look at those. But anyway, they're in the house. So anyway, that was the Townley Balfours. We'll come back to those in a minute. Now, just to give you some indication here, and now to give you some sort of context. Again, now the slide might be great in terms of the lighting and things like that. But this is a graph that was done up by these 2 historians in England for their look at their recipe books. And you can see here, what I just want to point out, I suppose, are the peaks in publication history, right? And the peaks in publication history, we're now switching to printed books. The peaks in published cookery books, the contrast is between Ireland and Britain and France. The peak is in the 18th century, okay? It's from the 1640s onwards, down it peaks, and then goes into for a little bit here. Okay, so the British line is the unbroken one, the broken line is France, because France produced a lot of books in the 18th century. And then they don't produce as many as England is doing throughout the 18th century. But the fascinating thing about the publication, I'll show you one of them now in a minute, the fascinating thing about the publication of cookery books in England throughout the 18th century is that they're being published by women, right? So it's women who are writing and collecting the recipes and publishing their collections in cookery books. And it's a big business in the 18th century, really, okay? So now, if you then compare that peak and all that sort of printing activity and publication history with what's going on in Ireland, you get a peak in the publication of handwritten recipe books in Ireland in and around the same time. So they're obviously taking their cues from what's going on in Britain. This is kind of a composite shot of what they look like. They look like all different things. So this is a 19th century collection by somebody called Mary Ponsonby. These are Irish ones now. So this is a beautiful collection here from County Kilkenny by somebody called Mrs. Baker, writing in the early 1820s, kind of Regency era kind of. And this is her collection here, look, beautiful. This is a recipe for gooseberry jelly, so the hand is gorgeous. This is what's taken to be from a Limerick 18th century collection for chocolate cream. I'll show you that in a minute. This is an index page that you can see here. And over here is just a close-up of a shot for one of the medicinal recipes for a jelly for the great weakness. Okay, so that could come in handy in all sorts of ways. Sometimes when they say they have recipes in the estate papers and when you call for them to be brought out, they might come out as just loose leaves, right? Rather than actually bound books. Okay, so the materiality of them kind of varies greatly. Sometimes when they come out, they're just like letters, and you can still see how they've been folded and wax stamped. So they're sending the recipes through the post, right? Receipts. So they're quite beautiful. And in terms of kind of the general characteristics about these collections, what you'll have is you'll have either loose leaves of a recipe, a letter or whatever, or you might have bound volumes, like all of the ones from, apart from the Trinity ones, all of the ones from Townley and Mrs. Baker, they're all bound, even though some of the binding might be more recent. Okay, so usually they're collections of bound recipes. A lot of the recipes are plagiarized. They're taken directly from printed books, right? You can see that quite easily. They're exchanged between family and friends. It's part of the kind of the culture of women that they'll exchange recipes. Because this is all part of their expression. These recipes are all an expression of their, what you might call, their cultural capital, you know, their style, their sophistication, their taste. That's what's going on. They can be inherited through the families. They can come through family, or they can be received in terms of the letters. And the recipes are typically taken from a British repertoire, a British culinary canon. There's no difference between cooking at this level in Ireland and England at this point. And the other thing is that not only are they just the recipes written down and all sorts of stuff, but they also can give judgments, like very good, or atrociously bad, or don't try this, okay? So they might kind of put that in the marginalia. And sometimes they will tell you who they've got the recipe from, sometimes they won't. And sometimes on very rare occasions they might say where it's come from, what cookery book it's taken from. That's extremely rare though. This is the one that with the chocolate cream, just to give you an idea. I'll just kind of flick through a few of them just to show you. This is a very strange collection. It's from Limerick. It's quite large, and it's a leather 2 or 3 volumes. I can't remember now, it's 2 or 3. And it looks like it was one that was almost commissioned, and that it was like a project that was undertaken, because if you look at it, it's very ordered. You know, they have this book is with, oh God, where are we going? We're going the wrong way. Oh no. Wait a second. I might have to resort. Oh yeah, here we are. Yeah, so when you open it, here you can see, this is what I wanted to do. You can see that you have this facility here to order the recipes alphabetically. And then the hand is very flamboyant. You can see it's almost Gothic-y type style, right? So it looked like it was like a planned volume, okay? And it's very ordered. Some of them, there's no order. It's completely haphazard. Most of the ones I looked at in Townley would be completely haphazard. The 1666 one from Dorothy Parsons is a completely different story there of composition, connected with her mother-in-law, and I can't get into that. So this one is really interesting as well. So they come in all sorts of different formats, I suppose you could say. Now, we'll go back to the recipe books later on. The other way that we know about food culture, of course, is, as I said to you, from other sources, apart from the recipes, things like letters and diaries. And there's 2 big collections of letters I always go to. One of them is the collection of letters from Mrs. Delaney, Mary Delaney, in Dublin, married to Patrick Delaney. And she's really active in her letter writing. I'll show you, they have a house in Dublin. She moves around because her husband is part of the Church of England, Church of Ireland. But she writes a lot of letters, particularly to, this is Mrs. Delaney as a young Mrs. Delaney, Mary Delaney, and she's very active in writing to her sister in England, Anne, right? They're writing letters all the time. Okay, so we saw a young Mrs. Delaney, and now this is the old Mrs. Delaney. This is in the Portrait Gallery from London. She's probably better known for her artwork in terms of actually artwork and fabric work. But she's a great recipe writer, and she's married to, this is her husband, Patrick Delaney, who's associated with the Church of Ireland. And this was their really lovely house. This is where they lived, in Delvin, in Glasnevin, in Dublin. And this is an illustration of it in the middle of the 18th century. And from those letters, and this is what it looked like in 1946. You can see the front elevation of the house. There's a little wheelbarrow there and everything. And she's really interesting because she has all of these letters that talk about what they're doing, where they're going, who they're meeting, who they're having dinner with, and she also talks about the state of the garden and things like that. So you get an indication as to what's being grown, right? For example, in 1744, she says, there's a very good kitchen garden. This is in Delvin now, right? Very good kitchen garden with 2 fruit gardens, which when proper repairs are made and they are set out in order, will afford a sufficient quantity of everything we want of that kind. So she's talking here about the kitchen gardens and the fruit gardens. And when you think of the estate, I suppose you can think of the estate house, the estates, the physicality of the estate on the landscape. You can think of it almost like as rippling out, okay? So you have the big house, and then you have, not far from the big house, you have the gardens of various different types. And we'll go into the big house now in a minute, we'll see one example. And then as you move out, you have the cultivation maybe of other types of vegetables, not the sophisticated ones, and then you go to the farmland and you go to the rental lands and all sorts of stuff. Okay, so there's layers of food activity, managing the landscape to produce food, right? So she's talking about her kitchen gardens here. Okay, so that's that. Mrs. Hamilton is my confectioner, and we'll go back and talk about sugar in a minute. What she means there is somebody who's working with sugar and probably baking goods. Mrs. Hamilton is my confectioner today, and is at this time making orange flour bread of my own orange flowers, of which I am not a little proud. I'm called to assist. Okay, so this is interesting. So so they have a confectioner who's a very skilled person in terms of kitchen activities. They're making orange flour bread. She's growing her own orange blossom flowers. Okay, this is a high kind of scented ingredient. And of course you have orange flower water, which is still used today. Okay, so that's that one. 1750, the temperature is pleasant as May, it's September. I've just been gleaning my autumn fruit, melon, this is now in Dublin, melon, figs, Bury pears, grapes, filberts, cultivated hazelnuts, and walnuts. Walnuts indeed are but just come in with us, right? So what they're growing on the estates, and this is only a relatively small house in Dublin, what they're growing on the estates and in some of the bigger estates is staggering, because you can see what they're buying in terms of their seeds and the seedsmen and the seed catalogues that are being produced. So you get your catalogue to pick out what you want to grow for the season. It's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. We talked, there's listening this morning to Countrywide and the tomato thing going on and all sorts of stuff, and you know, we get this sort of really dismissive thing like you'll only be eating turnips in winter. But if you look at what they're eating in the 18th century in Ireland, it's absolutely staggering. And they're cultivating and growing all that themselves. Granted, within elite communities, but what they're growing is extraordinary. Absolutely. You know, 16 or 17 different varieties of lettuce, peas, apples, pears. You can see them all. It's just incredible. And then she has on that house, they have a herd of venison, so deer. We killed a doe some time ago, a fine fat venison as ever was eaten. But Ione, though Dee, that's her husband, had laid a plot very carefully to deceive me so that he wouldn't know that I was eating it. So they're keeping deer for the table as well as with other things. As I said, her husband was in the Church of England, and this was where he had his church, not far from Delvin, the house itself in Glasnevin, and the whole house and the church is now gone, and that's what's on the site. It's the Bon Secours Hospital in Glasnevin. That's where they were based. One of the other collections which I find fascinating, it's really interesting, it's from Bishop Elphin, from Edward Singh in Elphin in County Roscommon. Again, he was involved in the church, and there he is, picture of him. And his letters have been edited and put together in a volume called The Sing Letters by Maria Louise Legge. Okay, there's just a collection of all their letters. It's absolutely fascinating. This is just an illustration of where he was, the Bishop's Palace in Elphin in 1813 and 1870, all right? And he's writing to his daughter, Alicia, in Dublin. So the daughter's gone off to Dublin, right, and they have property in Dublin. And of course that's the other thing, because all of the estates, because before the Act of Union, a lot of the estates will have political connections to Dublin and the sitting of the Parliament in Dublin. So they have very strong connections to the Dublin fashion set, right? And then they go to the estate for the rest of the year or whatever, when the Parliament isn't setting. So Bishop Edward Singh is kind of an example of that. He's up in Roscommon, but his daughter Alicia is in their house in Dublin, right? And it's here on Kevin Street, where the circle is there, right? And that's really interesting because look, you can see the street is here, and the houses are obviously street facing. But each of the houses have these elaborate constructions of gardens going on out the back, be they pleasure gardens, ornamental gardens, or gardens for food, and fruit in particular. But he's constantly writing. He had a big family of children, and the majority of them died. But Alicia is in Dublin, and he's constantly writing to her, right? Because I don't know, it seems like she's just gone mad in Dublin, and he's trying to keep control over her from Roscommon through the vehicle of the letter, okay? So there's letters flying back and forward between the two of them all the time, right? And they're really entertaining. So this is one from him, and he's kind of giving her instructions. So he's saying, if the grapes you sent Lady Grandison's are fine, you did well to send them. Sure. So he said that was a good thing to do, to send Lady Grandison grapes, right? Well done. I'm glad that you have any ripe fruit so early, and hope, whatever, there's a tear in the manuscript, I hope not all be so till I get my share. So he's saying, look, send some to me as well. It will be news to you that my garden, something here, has furnished me with about 100 very fine peaches. Okay, so he's got peaches going on, and she's growing grapes up in Dublin. But the other interesting here, though, is the exchange and the circulation of food, right? So she's grown the grapes in the gardener has grown the grapes in Dublin, and the daughter has sent them to Lady Grandison. So obviously what they're doing is they're networking, right? And they're saying, look, I grew these, have some of the grapes, right? So what they're doing is they're networking with influential people through the medium of food. Now, I send you with this recipe for saffron cakes. So he's after sending her a recipe for saffron cakes up to Dublin, which I'm told is the right one, and I believe it, because Mr. Phibbs, from whose wife it comes, sent it with some cakes, which obviously were saffron cakes, which Mrs. Wills and all her company agreed to be for the colour, the saffron colour, the taste, and everything so good as the best of old Gaffney. Let me see now how good housewives you'll prove yourselves by making some to perfection. I got the letter you described. I have time for no more. God send us a happy meeting and take notice. I won't have you in a flutter. I am my dearest. Okay, so he's after sending up to Dublin a recipe for saffron cakes. And he's saying, try them now, and I hope that they work well. This is the right recipe. Another one. Your account of fruit, etc., is bad enough. No remedy. If anything else fails outright, you must bear their loss. They're talking about the fruit garden as well. But I really believe that Roberts has been, they're always giving out about the staff. I really believe that Roberts has been negligent, and that his apology for the loss of his first crop of melons is, in plain English, a lying excuse. Or if it is true, what can he say for his suffering of his frames in such condition? So he's saying, look, the melons have been a disaster, whatever they're growing here. He's saying he can't help but the gardener. But then the father, Bishop Singh, is saying, well, look, just look at the condition of the frames. You know, the hotbed frames. He's after leaving those get out of condition completely. Right? So there's that going on. So it's absolutely fantastic to see what they're doing with food. These are the letters and all sorts of stuff. And as I said to you, food, and particularly these exotics, in terms of exotic fruits and vegetables, these are things that they can exchange for networking purposes. And as I said, they're taking their cues from all sorts of recipe books. Like this is the most famous one of the 18th century. Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy, first published in London by herself, Mrs. Glass, in 1847. And it became a runaway bestseller for nearly 100 years. She was like the Delia Smith of the 18th century. Several editions published in Dublin until into the 19th century, printed and published in Dublin. I'll show you one in a minute. So this, like her book is a kind of a classic insight into the food culture, what they're cooking, what the dishes are, and all sorts of stuff. And then I told you that, you know, sometimes I try these, and there's me here with two little girls, and this was a program that was made called for TV3 called The Big House, back about, oh God, I don't know how many years ago now. But what they did was they moved descendants of the staff who would have worked in the name now has gone out of my head, Roscommon. What's the big house in Roscommon? Strokestown. So what this production company did was they found descendants of the staff working in Strokestown House, and they moved them into the house for the weekend, and they made them work in the house. Okay, so in the kitchen, where I was, there was a group of kitchen maids. They're the kitchen maids here, and then various different levels of cooks, because the head cook was the most important. Then you'd have other cooks, and the kitchen maids were doing all the kind of the bottom of the pile jobs, really. So we were in the kitchen, and there were two people upstairs who were the Lord and Lady, and they were having their breakfasts and dinners and all sorts of stuff. So they had to be fed, and they had to be fed in 3 centuries, okay, for the 3 days, right? So we cooked for the three centuries, and this is some of the 18th century dishes, okay, that we would have made with them. This is a potato pudding. So this is a whole load of floury potatoes boiled, mashed down. And they're mashed with cream and alcohol and eggs and spices and dried fruits. Yeah. And it becomes almost like a flowing consistency, and it's then poured into a dish that will be pastry lined, and it's baked, right? So you get a potato pudding. It's really popular, and it's really gorgeous.
Sorry,
It's
Oh, sweet.
Oh, yeah, I like, oh yes, it's sweet, and it's really lovely. It's like a baked cheesecake. So that's gorgeous. And if you didn't know it was potatoes, you wouldn't know. These are black caps. These are either orange flower water or rose water flavored apples that are baked to give them this little black cap, right? So these are beef olives. These are cuts of prime beef that are flattened, hammered flat, and they're stuffed and rolled with sweetbreads and stuffing and spices and all sorts of stuff. They're really gorgeous. And then we have here an egg fricassee, and we have, these are the sweetbreads actually here that we cooked. They were breaded and cooked, and this is an egg fricassee. This here, the beef olives are in this kind of what you might look at as being kind of like a brown gravy, and this is really, really very popular at the time, but it's something that is made from scratch, from stock, from beef. You make the beef stock and all sorts of stuff, and then it's reduced and it's flavoured and all sorts of stuff. So that takes ages to make. Now, the thing, these are only a very small selection of a whole collection, a huge collection of dishes that are characteristic of the 18th century. The thing about Julia's question is a very relevant one, because you might think, why are they having that with beef? Why are they having the cheesecake, which is a potato pudding, with the beef? It's because that's what they did, because the separation of tastes doesn't happen until towards the end of the 18th century. So when they have a dinner, for example, they'll have several different courses, like we have. But in each course, it's not one thing, it's a whole collection of dishes, right? So the first course, usually the first course is soup, and it's got maybe other things with it. So other small dishes. So the soup will come out, and the soup will be eaten, and then it's removed. It's called the remove. And then the first course after the remove comes in, and that, if you imagine your table, and your table is like a big, long, hot buffet of loads of different dishes, okay, that are all very symmetrically placed, right? So symmetrically placed in the table, so you're sitting down at the table, and in front of you could be this whole plethora of different dishes that you can choose from yourself. You choose bits and pieces. So it's like a sit-down hot buffet. And the first course would usually be the bigger cuts of meat, particularly the roast meats and that sort of stuff, right? And then they have all these ancillary dishes that go with them, like the black caps or the potato pudding and all sorts of stuff. So you're getting this mix of savoury and sweet going on at the same time. And then the second course would be more like the smaller dishes here, like these are called made dishes. They're kind of like the roasts and all that sort of stuff. These are the made dishes, which will come out again in a great variety on the table. So you're sitting, there's nobody actually serving you the first course or whatever and taking the plate away. You're kind of doing that yourself. And that ritual, that table ritual is called service à la française, right? That gets replaced towards the end of the 19th century by the service of first course, second course, third course, like we would do if we go to a restaurant. That's called service à la service à la Russe. That replaces this older buffet style towards the end of, well, coming into the 19th century, really. It's starting to replace it as the more fashionable way of doing things. The point here, though, and I suppose this was borne out when we were working with the girls in the kitchen, was that the time that's involved in cooking is incredible. Like, it's just non-stop. So you start early in the morning making the breakfasts. Then you have to have and breakfast time will change as well through time. And dinner times will change through time. You know, they're not all the time that we eat now. But the cooking in the kitchen is non-stop. It's going on and on and on and on and on. It's really laborious. As are things like like these were two young boys they had in the dining room where the food was produced, you know, looking after all the silver and the material culture of the table, you know. So the amount of labour and time that goes into sustaining this culture is extraordinary. It really is. And I don't know if Terence Dooley, for those of you who were at Terence Dooley's talk, what they did in the big houses was they aimed to employ the head servants, not from Ireland, but they employed them in from England. So the butler, the housekeeper, the cook, they would be brought in from England because they would have been trained in England. And they were brought in because these are the big jobs, the big staff jobs in the big houses. So they don't want the whole thing like falling apart because the cook can't cook, especially if you're inviting other people to the house that you want to impress. For all of these kind of, you know, this is a network of elites in society. So the food plays a really big function in maintaining their status and in demonstrating their aspirations to grandeur, a display of wealth, showing their taste and all sorts of stuff. So you can't have somebody in the kitchen who's kind of, you know, burning everything like. So you have to have somebody who's trained and knows what they're doing. So there's a hierarchy in the kitchen. And a lot of the cooks were brought in, they were trained in England, they went to cookery school in England, and they were employed and brought over to Ireland. The other house that I kind of worked with to some extent, I don't know if any of you recognise this, it's in Cork, and this is Photo House, right? And this would have been one of the hunting lodges of the Barry family on the island of Fota, the little island of Fota, just before you cross over to the bigger island, which is Cove. Again, it's a relatively minor house in the general scheme of things, but what it does have, you can just see here, this is the house, these are the gardens as they exist now. This is the entrance hall, the drawing room. But what you can see here is the management of the landscape for either pleasure gardens or for the cultivation of exotics and high status luxury foods. At this point, these would have been the vegetable gardens, they're not anymore. This is their orangery for growing their oranges and lemons and citrons. This area has been, since this photograph was taken, this area has been restored into what they call the frame yard. It's like a garden of frames of glass houses. It's absolutely beautiful. These would have been some of their fruit and vegetable gardens as well. Okay? So now, and these are all the elite exotic things for the table. You know, they're not concerned with what might be going on there in the kitchen gardens that are further from the house that might be growing the kind of the staples, like the cabbages and the turnips, you know, the things that we've been denigrating in the last few days. So there's a hierarchy in all of these things too. You were kind of going, oh look, peaches are being grown, you know, in Dublin. Yes, they are, and they've been growing in a lot of the big houses. And what the big houses will have in their walled gardens, which are a study within themselves, is that a lot of the walls of the wall gardens will be of double wall construction, not in Fota, because the temperature in Fota is very temperate. It's a very, very mild climate. It's the microclimate in Fota, actually. But what you see in some of the kitchen gardens is you'll have double walls, so that the space in between the double walls is for heating the walls. So they have a heating system going through. Okay, so at various junctures, depending on the heating system, at various junctures you might have kilns that are set up to burn, to send hot steam or hot water through the pipes to keep the walls warm, particularly when things like peaches, nectarines, plums, apples and pears are in blossom. You want to keep the walls warm so that the blossom isn't killed off by frost, and then you'll have no fruit. Okay, so it's incredible. And all of these wall gardens, all of the walls are utilised depending on their facing, where they're facing. They'll be utilised in accordance with if they're facing north, south, east and west. And there's a whole kind of system of rotation going on here and all sorts of stuff. That's the head gardener. And again, they would have been brought in from outside. So the head gardener, the cook, the butler and the housekeeper, they're keeping the show on the road, really. And this is the kitchen from Fota. It's absolutely incredible. Now, it's not functional, but it was kind of hidden, but it's been brought back. So in here is the scullery, and that door here, where you see just this door here, that leads out to a walkway between the kitchen and the garden. Okay, so you walk from the garden to the kitchen with whatever produce is in season. It comes into the scullery where it's washed and cleaned and prepped, and it's brought into this main kitchen area. And you might say to yourself, oh, this is very, well, it's very impressive, but it looks very, not very technologically up to date, but they have all the cooking mediums going on here. So over here is the closed oven for making your breads, cakes, biscuits. Here you have hot range areas, just in this little piece here. This is a heating area to keep things hot. Over here, you can't see it, but there's a huge big boiling pot for boiling. This stretch here is for grilling and broiling. It's like a series of mini barbecues. And here, the central feature is the roasting spit. And there's a series of basket spits here that you can open, and they've got kind of spears in them. And you spear your meat onto them depending on the size, and you can close the basket so they won't fall off. And they're rotated continuously. This is the mechanical rotation spit system here. You can see up here. And they rotate, and the fire is in front of the spit, not under the spit, right? So the fire is in front. So this is a very skilled technique of how to manage the spit and make true roast meat, not baked meat. This is roasted meat in the open air, not baked meat, sorry. Not sure what that is. And this is part of kind of English culinary tradition, that even though they have ovens and all sorts of stuff, they wanted to keep the flavour and the taste of roasted meat. That's what they wanted. So you see the spits continue in practice long into the 18th and into the 19th centuries. And it becomes almost a symbol of national identity, you know, English roast beef and pudding and all sorts of stuff. Okay, so that's there. The other thing about Fota is it has, I suppose, one of the, not the only, but one of the last surviving cold storerooms and game carousels in the country. And you can see this room is just after, if you walk up the passageway here, you go into the cold larder and the game carousel. Because you see, the other thing of networking was not just to have the dinners and all sorts of stuff, but depending on where the estate was, if you had land that you could give over to game, birds and animals, that was another occasion of coming together with these elite groups for the hunting season. So you might hunt in Fota first and move on to hunt somewhere else. And because you had the glut of produce, of course, that was all converted into foods, not just roasted meats or whatever, but also then into a whole kind of family of different pies and pasties and all sorts of stuff. So there's their hanging carousel where the animals will be hung. So that's extraordinary to actually see. That kitchen in Fota is very similar, but it's in better condition now in terms of its survival. It's in better condition than the one in Strokestown. which I couldn't remember the name earlier. And this is Strokestown. It's very similar. They're probably built to a conventional style and pattern and format. So I suppose just to bear in mind the wealth, the equipment, the knowledge, the skill, and of course the staff that needed to maintain this food and culinary culture. These are some of the recipes. I just put this one in because I liked it. This was a book I opened and found a pressed leaf. So you find all the things in that. But then if you think about the kitchen, right, this is what's guiding the kitchen. It's the recipe books, okay? So this is a contents page from the Mrs. Baker book from the early 1820s from County Kilkenny. This is one that you saw already from County Limerick. A recipe here, this is Mrs. Baker's one for lemon cream. Take 3 lemons, pare them very thin, and put the rind in a pottenger, it's a utensil, and half of fair water with the juice, and all let them lie an hour, then strain into a silver basin, put in a little rose and orange flower water if you please, strain in your eggs, 2 whites, put in a 1/4 pound of double refined sugar, finely beaten, set the basin on a chafing dish on coals and stir in one way till it grows thick. Okay, so that's just a kind of, it's just a jelly, it's like a lemon cream. And there is another, she's just putting in a recipe here, which is quite interesting, to perfume jelly, to give it this perfume. And they're using the ambergris, which is this almost secretion that comes from, it's like the gallstone of a whale that you find washed beach, it washes up on beaches, and dogs are very good at finding it, and it looks like kind of calcified bone, and you grate that into dishes to give this extraordinary perfume to dishes. Okay, that's just one of these exotic ingredients. Chocolate, cream, and all sorts of stuff. Shallot ketchup. These are ketchup, they call it catsup. Ketchup made of shallots and all sorts of stuff. And a fricassee of eggs, which Mrs. Baker tells us is excellent. It's like the one I made. Okay, so that's that. And then just to show you that it's not just the kitchen and the recipe books and all of the labour and all sorts of stuff, but where all of this activity went on was not just a kitchen, it was an entire complex of activity. And this is the ground floor plan of the kitchen complex in Photo House. Okay, so what you have here, number 2 there is the scullery with the door that's going out to this passageway. And if you walk up there for a bit, you can walk into their whole series of orchards, frame yards, and wall gardens up there, if you remember from my shot. So that's the scullery. This is the storehouse. That's the main kitchen. Number 4 is the game larder, where you saw the carousel with the game, the cold larder. Number 5 is the dry larder, where they have all the dry ingredients. Now, number 6 is really interesting. It's here listed as the servants, as the housekeeper's room. Oh no, sorry. Number 6 is the housekeeper's room, and number 7 is the housekeeper's room, and number 6 is the still room. Okay, and number 10 is the butler's room. Right. So that you have the butler here, the housekeeper there, and the still room there. Right, and the still room is connected to the housekeeper's room. Right? Now, the still room is really interesting because the still room is from the word distill, distillation. And what was going on, and if you remember back when Mrs. Delaney was talking about her confectioner making orange flour bread, and she was called to assist, that's really interesting. Because if you think back here, this is the main kitchen, right? And there's all sorts of stuff going on in there. Roasting, boiling, broiling, baking. It's a really intense working environment. And you don't really want to be associated with that. It's too overtly work and all sorts of stuff, right? But the women of the houses did have an involvement in things, and the things they wanted to be involved in were the things associated with distilling and sugar. Okay, they wanted to be involved with sugar because sugar was the new fashionable ingredient that was coming in from the New World, especially in the 17th century, but booming in the 18th century. So sugar was an exotic luxury ingredient. And what it did was it gave the women in the houses a pastime, a sophisticated pastime, distilling cordials and medicines based on sugar, because sugar originally was medicinal, right? That was the belief. But then you had all of these things going on. And then you had the sugar used for things like making jams and preserves and jellies and spreads, like the creams with the lemons there that we saw. And then you had the whole area of cakes and baking going on. And then you had the whole area of really sophisticated sugar work for the table. Sugar sculptors, sugar confections, and all sorts of stuff. If they weren't making themselves, if they didn't have skilled confectioners on site, they were buying in from the confectioners that were in the bigger cities like Dublin and Cork and so on. And sometimes they would even rent the sugar sculptor for an occasion and give it back again. And sugar became this ingredient that changed everything. Because when Julie asked the question, was the potato pudding sweet? Yes, it was. And they were eating that with a savoury beef olive, for example. And that is reminiscent of the way it was in the medieval past when you had sweet and savoury all mixed up together. But as you go through the 18th century, and you'll see that in the collections of recipes like from the Balfours or any collections, what you see happening is that sugar is native to Asia, all right? And then it goes from Asia to some of the islands off Africa that are owned by the Spanish and the Portuguese. It's cultivated there. And then, though, when the New World opens up, America, the sugar cultivation moves to the Americas, all right? Down around the West Indies, Barbados and all of that. And of course that is on the back of the exportation of humans, slaves from Africa, into the plantations. So America is producing sugar. Europe is connected now with the Americas because they founded it, so you know, if you like, during the Age of Discovery. And what they're doing is they're engaged in this triangle of trade. Okay, Europe, Africa, America, America, Europe, Africa. So you get all stuff going out from Africa into the Americas. America sending back over to Europe things like sugar, chocolate is native to the Americas, tomatoes, not native to the Mediterranean as we might think. They're coming in from the New World. And Europe is sending out raw commodity to support the plantations. Cork becomes one of the biggest food exporting points of the British Empire at this point, sending out butter and salted meat. But the big demand in Europe, growing and growing and growing in demand, is for sugar. That's what they want. Because sugar lets them do all of these sophisticated things in the kitchen. But also, sugar makes chocolate palatable. You can't eat chocolate without, well you can, but you know, it's not nice. So sugar makes chocolate palatable. Sugar is what you want to put into your coffee. Sugar is what you want to put into your tea. All of these things become ritualistic performances in the 18th century. So sugar is dictating, it's the largest global trading commodity by the 18th century. And what it's doing then is that because the demand is growing, the plantations get bigger, there's more slaves brought over, it becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And eventually what it does, as it becomes more used in cookery and all sorts of stuff, it starts to separate the idea of sweet and savoury. Because now you have so much sugar, you can make sweet dishes, desserts and all that sort of stuff. And you can hive off your savoury stuff. And that's how we have the taste palette developed now. We go from savoury to sweet. We don't really mix the two. You might like, but you know, we've been kind of brought up on savoury and sweet as being separate taste entities. And it's all on the back of sugar. And it's all on the back of, I suppose, the exploitation of humans really for profit. And a lot of these big estates are involved in the sugar plantations as well, you know, in Ireland and of course in England and throughout Europe as well. So if you go then through the cookery books like the Balfours, like you'll see that there's a lot of things, like there's culinary recipes and all sorts of stuff, but a lot of the culinary recipes you can nearly separate down then into how they're using sugar, because it increases considerably. And these recipe books aren't concerned with roasting a piece of meat or baking a loaf of bread. What the recipe books are concerned with, if you like, is kind of a higher order of cooking, things that are a bit more complicated and sophisticated to make. They're not giving you instructions about how to roast a big piece of sirloin beef, even though that's what they love, like. But, you know, that's something that's going on in the kitchen. But the recipe books are concerned with sugar, ordered cooking, made dishes, and so on. So if you take, for example, things like beef and meats and veals, all the things that you can make from those, apart from the big roast dishes, would be things like calf's foot jelly. Takes ages to make from a calf's foot, and then it comes out really looking sophisticated. You'd never know it was a calf's foot because it's in this beautiful sausages, puddings. They're using flavour and textures of marrows and suet in their dishes. Pies made with mince pies, made with minced tongues particularly, or beef, but tongues especially. Calf's foot pies. They're using beef and stock as a cooking agent. They're using a lot of it for stuffing and force meats. And then you have all these dishes like hashed calf's head, stuffed fillets of veal, fricassee of veal, Scotch collops and soups, and preserved, semi-preserved items like collared meats, potted meats, and salt and spiced meats. That's just one ingredient. Okay, then we can't go into all of those. That was just to focus on beef. But like you were asking about the tables and how they, and I'll finish now. I'll finish now in a few slides because I'm not sure how long I've gone on. But you asked how they were eating and the table and all sorts of stuff. This is a little notebook I found from Townley Hall, and it was a notebook that somebody had done up on the organisation of the tables for a number of dinners in the early 19th century. So this is one from 1811. And look, this is how you organise all your things on the table. So ducks, salmon and sole at this end, right? Up here, I have to move closer myself. Up here you have green pea soup, roast beef, will be the first course. Flummery, it's a dish kind of like we think of porridge, but it's a bit more sophisticated. And down here then, they have pork and lamb and hare and fried bits. There's a recipe for that. And there are other things, like there's other fowls over here and tartlets, and there's something else up there that I have no glasses to see now at the moment. And then over here they've made a note. They're talking about how the things should come out with napkins and things on them. But they're saying, look, this dinner here, this is just a family dinner, so there's no need for a second course. They just have tarts, right? So they have all of this anyway, and then they're saying, we have enough here now, we won't go to the second course, we'll just have tarts instead coming out for the second course. So they have a soup, which in this instance is green pea, which is actually very seasonal now. So they have the soup will be removed, it will be replaced by the big roasted kind of things and so on. And then they have all of these other little bits here are going to come out as well, like the table that we saw from Strokestown. And then they might take a break, I suppose, and bring out the tarts at the end of the meal. When you look at the dinner plans and the arrangements for, if they have, you know, big organised dinners, they can go into several courses. You know, they can go through really several courses, where again you have all of the setup of the whole the hot buffet idea, with, you know, that you can run up to 100 different types of dishes throughout the courses, and they all have to be made in those kitchens by the staff. Some of them are highly skilled, and the skills have been passed on. And all of this, of course, is to demonstrate wealth, elite, status, and the knowledge of refinement and good taste. But to support all of that, you had to have the estate, you had to have the staff, you had to have the money, the wealth, and the influence. And in many instances, you had to have the aspect of exploitation as well, which you see, of course, in the huge increase in the production of sugar as it comes into Europe. Okay, I think I better stop there now because Julia's moving towards me. So we'll stop and I'll take any questions as well. Thanks very much.